Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the Alberta Roundup. If you're watching this as it's being released, then I'm likely at True North's conference in Calgary, and I hope that my speech went well. Thanks, everyone, for the ideas provided on the top 10 worst leftist ideas over the last few years. As for this week's episode, I had the chance to sit down with Richard Durr and discuss the UCP's upcoming AGM in Red Deer on November 2nd. Richard Durr is an award-winning politician consultant with extensive experience working on campaigns across Canada. On top of his professional work, he is also the volunteer executive director of Pro-Life Alberta, an organization dedicated to advancing pro-life public policy in the province. You may have read one of his two recently published op-eds with True North where he discussed Smith and her engagement with parental rights. In his op-eds, Richard discussed Smith's selective approach to addressing parental rights, focusing on gender-related medical procedures, which he argued didn't properly address broader parental rights, and opened her up to opposition from the trans community, who say that her policies unfairly target trans kids. Richard focused on the issue of abortion, which he claimed was the most glaring example of Smith's inconsistency, because a minor can get an abortion without parental consent, but not a vaccine or a routine dental procedure. In his op-eds, Richard Durr said, quote, "The opportunity is there for Smith to broaden her approach and address the full range of parental rights issues, including parental notification for minors seeking abortions and other significant medical interventions. By doing so, her government can align itself more closely with the values expressed by the party membership and most Albertans, in fact, while simultaneously preventing even the perception that her policies unfairly target trans youth. It's time for the government to go beyond largely symbolic gestures and deliver real change for parents across the province." He added that, quote, "In other areas of life, whether it's a tattoo, a body piercing, or school staff administering Tylenol, parental consent is required. Yet, despite widespread public support for requiring parental consent, minors in Alberta are currently able to obtain an abortion without it. Yet, if a parent's permission is needed for something as benign as a school trip to the zoo, shouldn't it be required for a life-altering decision like abortion? No child should face the burden of a life or death decision alone." Richard and I spoke in further detail about not only key policies, but the upcoming AGM and his expectations. You can listen to that interview now. All right, Richard. So, with the UCP's AGM coming up on November 2nd, I'm just curious what your overall expectations are for the event, and if there are any key issues you think will dominate discussions this year.
Well, I'm not so sure about key issues that might dominate the discussion. I'm sure that there will be emphasis and likely great emphasis on the parental notification and gender policy surrounding gender-related medical interventions. I'm sure that will play large in throughout the conference.
And then as for Smith's leadership review, which has obviously been a focal point of the AGM, I'm wondering if you have any insight into what her expectations might be. For example, former Premier Jason Kenney, obviously he surpassed the threshold with 51.4% approval, but subsequently resigned because he said obviously 51.4% was way below his expectations. So I'm wondering if you have any idea what Smith's kind of, I guess, expectations will be for what percentage she's kind of going to try and meet threshold-wise?
Well, I mean, historically, it's always been above 80% or around 80% has always been what's been preferred by incumbent leaders. So I would imagine that in her case, it's much the same. And we'll have to wait and see as to whether she'll have stronger policy commitments in exchange for widespread support that might help ensure that she does receive the vote of confidence from UCP members above that threshold.
Yeah, and do you think that's pretty likely that she'll get above that 80% number?
We'll have to wait and see. I mean, I think it's definitely a possibility. We'll have to wait and see. She has shown herself to be, to her credit, someone who's open to listening. She's whip smart. She's photogenic. She has many of the qualities that embody solid leadership. And it's just, I think there's just an expectation of follow through that that many UCP members have not seen and would like to see. So I think it might depend somewhat on that. And we'll have to see how it goes with the convention overall. I mean, she is open to continuing to listen. I know there's for members, there's an upcoming what would that be, a tele-town hall coming up on the 26th. So I know that she continues to reach out to party members in hopes of solidifying her support.
And do you think that Smith's approach to date regarding her strategy surrounding parental rights and as you mentioned in your 2 op-eds with us, focusing on gender-related medical procedures has resonated with UCP members and even taking it a step further with the broader public?
I do indeed. I think it represents a good first step. I think that though by expanding parental notification requirements to include all medical interventions, this would function as a sword and a shield issue for her. It would be a sword in that the associated electoral risk that the NDP would be forced to manage in having to stake out a position either in favor of what Smith is doing or in opposition to it, which would suggest that they take on a position of government knows best, which I do not think would be well received by the public at large. And it functions also as a shield issue in that it helps to prevent or it shields against opponents who accuse Smith of unfairly targeting trans kids. So I think if she expands parental notification requirements, as is already past UCP policy, I think it's 206.5B, but you could probably pull that up for your viewers. That requires parental consent for a whole range of serious, irreversible elective procedures performed on minors. And I think that her expanding the criteria of medical interventions that would require parental notification would be to her benefit. And like I said, function both as a sword and shield issue for her.
Yeah, and you had mentioned the policy 206.5B in one of your op-eds. I think you said that members had overwhelmingly voted yes on it at the previous AGM, but still it's a slow process in seeing it come forward. And obviously these policies are non-binding. So I'm just looking for your overall thoughts. Obviously, there have been 35 policy resolutions put forward by UCP members this year. So in the past, what have you kind of seen from these non-binding policies, and how does it really sway not only Smith but the UCP party as a whole with the motions that they bring forward?
Well, as to how much it sways UCP, the leadership in the UCP, so to speak, or elected MLAs, that's always hard to see. I mean, it takes away one additional excuse for them not to do something, if we can put it in those terms. And it does demonstrate then that there is support, at least amongst partisan members, to pass a policy. And so I think that is important. On the other hand, it also engages the grassroots in policy decisions that matter to them. But it does so in a way then that doesn't bind elected representatives to adhere to or follow through or pass legislation reflecting those policies passed. And in most cases, I would say that that's probably rather unfortunate if you of course, support those policies. So in that sense, it's I think that it's important, though, that they, especially with the, again, emergence even in this AGM of additional public policy proposals that ask for parental notification and parental involvement in medical interventions, that that should be a sign that there is a strong desire, especially amongst UCP members, but it can also be found in Alberta, in the Alberta public at large, for and expanding parental notification requirements to include all medical interventions performed on minors.
And you kind of alluded to this already, but I'm just curious, how responsive do you think Smith has been so far as a leader to the wants and needs of the party members? And I'm wondering whether you think that with this leadership review upcoming, she has that shifted her responsiveness in any way?
Well, she is responsive in terms like she listens, and I think that's to her credit. However, I would like to see stronger policy commitments in addition to that listening, and that these commitments aren't just something spoken in word, but that are legislatively enacted, so that it results then in real policy. That's what is expected. That's what the membership expects of her, and that's not an unreasonable expectation.
And I'm wondering, what do you think a best case scenario looks like for Smith at this upcoming AGM, and conversely, a worst case scenario, aside from her, of course, getting ousted as leader with the review?
Well, I think there you pointed out the worst case scenario. The best case scenario, I think, is that she, from the perspective of the membership and from my perspective, would be that there's a stronger policy commitment for expanding parental notification requirements to include all medical interventions performed on minors. I don't think that's an unreasonable position to take whatsoever. And again, I believe that would function both as a shield and a sword issue that would be politically beneficial for Smith and the UCP party to adopt. That in her doing so, she would, in exchange, get strong support from the membership to continue on as leader.
Yeah, Richard, is there anything else I haven't asked or covered that you'd like to say?
I think the UCP membership has clearly stated already in the past, by way of its public policy pronouncements, that parents, not bureaucrats, should be responsible for making the determinations when it involves serious, irreversible elective procedures performed on minors. And it's my sincere hope that Smith and the UCP party leadership will honor those policy pronouncements and enact that into legislation that I think would be accepted by the Alberta population at large.
And will I see you at the AGM, or are you attending?
Indeed, you will. I'm excited to be there, and it'll be nice to meet you in the flesh, Isaac.
Right on. I'll see you then, Richard. Thanks a lot for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Per the policy 206.5B that Richard discussed in his op-eds and a bit more on the show, it reads, quote, ensure that all minor children are protected from harm by requiring the consent of a parent or legal guardian for all invasive medical procedures performed on a minor child, subject to established emergency medical protocols, legal emancipation, or judicial intervention. During this year's AGM, Policy Resolutions number 7 and number 8 both directly touch on parental rights. A few other policies address trans rights and biological sexes, but Policy Resolution number 7 calls on the Government of Alberta to, quote, support a bill of parental rights which ensures that legislation will recognize, support, and 1. acknowledge that a parent's prior right and responsibility to raise their children precedes government legislation and does not flow from it. 2. Provide legislative clarity for the courts to uphold and enforce the existing defined and legislated legal age limits of the province. 3. Protect parents who are providing the necessities for the child's health, education, and welfare as they exercise their parental custody and authority, and does not interfere based on religious, social, or fiscal grounds. 4. Include remedial provisions for unjustified interference by government, organizations, or individuals in order to limit overreach. And 5, affirm that the ultimate responsibility for a legally defined minor child's health, education, and welfare lies with the parents or legal guardians by legislating to regulate the practice of subjectively ascribing children, quote, mature minor status. Policy number 8 calls on the Government of Alberta to, quote, support parental rights in education by implementing the following. 1. Require teachers and school boards obtain opt-in informed written consent from the parents of a student to any instance when a teacher provides formal, informal, or incidental instruction or extracurricular activities on subject matter involving sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. At the parent's written request, the teacher of the student shall permit the student to leave the classroom without academic penalty or other censure. And 2, require that all third-party resource materials or presentations related to gender, identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality available in Alberta classrooms be pre-approved by the Ministry of Education. That pretty much wraps out the show today. I hope to see some of you at the upcoming AGM in Red Deer on November 2nd. If you see me there, feel free to stop by and say hi. Thank you, have a good week, and God bless.